on for one dendritic world.
Thank you so much. So it is not obvious just what Everettian quantum mechanics, which I'll refer to as EQM, the duration of thought, tells us about reality. Under EQM, the universal wave function is fundamental, and it evolved entirely according to the Schrodinger equation without collapse. Beyond this, David Wallace argues that there exists an emergent branching structure of decoherent worlds, where each branch corresponds to a quasi-classical history. Building on this framework, Al Wilson posits what he calls quantum modal realism, where the universal wave function describes the concrete, a collection of decoherent Everettian worlds where, in his words, quote, possible worlds are as real as the actual world. Although Everettian quantum mechanics appears to lend itself well to modal realism, this approach requires excessive metaphysical commitments, the exact sort of which render EQM unpalatable to naysayers. For this reason, I suggest that we re-examine an earlier treatment of EQM with the hope that it will be physically fruitful. So, in 1970, Brice DeWitt stated that the beauty of EQM lies in its ability to yield its own interpretation, where each measurement event causes the universe to split into branches, and each possible outcome obtains along at least one branch. These universe branches are otherwise identical. Drawing inspiration from DeWitt's intuition that EQM suggests a branching structure, I take the entire structure itself to be the world. So in this sense, I argue for one dendritic world. This presentation is organized as follows. In section 1, I recount and taxonomize pre-existent accounts of decoherent branching. Next, in section 2, I present an argument for why we ought to take seriously a one-world metaphysics where all possible outcomes obtain. Then in section 3, I build a positive model for such a metaphysics, and I demonstrate how this account addresses the issue of identity that was damning for previous world-splitting accounts. Good, okay. So in his 2012 book, Wallace offers 4 distinct metaphysical pictures of decoherent branching, 2 of which are relevant to our discussion today, the Lewisian view and the Hydra view. So of the Lewisian view, Wallace writes, possible worlds are branches in a decoherent history space. That is, sets of possible worlds are more or less coarse-grained histories within the emergent branching structure defined by decoherence. On this view, decoherence events trigger branching, distinguishing sets of worlds from one another. The number of distinct branches is a function of our decisions around coarse graining. The degree of detail used to differentiate the branches will dictate just how many worlds are distinguishable from one another post-decoherence. Critically, these possible worlds do not overlap at any point in time. They never share temporal parts. Instead, sets of possible worlds diverge from one another via decoherence events. And agents living within any particular world can only make probabilistic statements about the future evolution of their world given the current state and the Schrodinger equation. Within each world, exactly one outcome will obtain for each quantum mechanical process. The agent within such a world ought to condition over their past to compute the probability of any future outcome. Thus, the probability of any particular outcome will correspond to the probability distribution of outcomes over the entire collection of possible worlds that are more or less indistinguishable from the actual worlds, those worlds that have not yet diverged from ours. So, in contrast, Wallace writes of the Hydra view, possible worlds are trajectories through Hilbert space. That is, they specify at each time the physical state of the entire universe and each possible world within the decoherent structure, and each possible world in which decoherence occurs is an entire branching structure. So there are critical differences between this view and the Lewisian view. First, the possible worlds themselves are not individual histories through the branching structures, but instead complete dendritic structures themselves. So the probability of any particular history is either 0 or 1. In this sense, the probability of any, just what can be said about the future is a more complicated problem. On this account, if it's the case that all possible outcomes obtain, then these different outcomes obtain along different quasi-classical branches. Once again, the number of branches is a function of coarse graining. So citing a serious concern about common natural language utterances, Wallace advocates for the Lewisian view. He writes, on this account, my world does not literally branch at all when, say, a quantum measurement is made. Rather, the recurrent of my world is a non-branching, four-dimensional continuum, the pre-measurement part of which is qualitatively identical with, indeed supervenient on, the same microphysical facts as many other worlds up until the time of measurement. My uncertainty about which outcome I see is mere indexical uncertainty. Uncertainty about my place in the world. But it is an uncertainty which cannot, even in principle, be removed prior to branching. So by adopting this Lewisian approach, Wallace avoids some problems related to identity, at least for natural language utterances, on a model where the world branches. So Al Wilson sort of takes this view and runs with it. From this framework, he develops a view that he calls quantum modal realism, according to which it remains the case that, quote, ever-eddying worlds do not neurologically overlap. But in contrast to Wallace's approach to semantics, where Wallace sort of treats other possible outcomes as like mere abstracta for natural language purposes, Wilson fully commits himself to the claim that each ever-eddying world is actual according to its own inhabitants, and only its own inhabitants. But nevertheless, all of the worlds are concrete, critically. So perhaps Christina Conroy offers yet another picture, taking the terms of the universal wave function that are not actualized in our world, not to correspond to sets of propositions that are true in other concrete worlds, but instead to be statements about how the world might have been. Conroy writes, there is only one term of the universal wave function that describes the states of affairs that obtain. The term that describes the actual world as we happen to experience it. The other terms describe our one concrete world in counterfactual ways. There are other possible worlds, but only in the sense of them being other maximal sets of propositions that describe our world. They're not concrete worlds as proposed by other interpretations of EQM. Since Conroy does not take any state of affairs that differs from those in the actual world to be concrete, and since she does not require the existence of possible worlds, period, we are free to read her model as a genuine one-world model. Further, she affirms that her interpretation offers, quote, a single-world interpretation of Everett's pure wave mechanics. We might then assume that when decoherence events take place, the history along which factual statements are true diverts away from other possible paths through the branching structure, where counterfactual statements are true. But I'll quickly interject that I imagine a single-world approach to EQM should be quite appealing to those who bemoan the metaphysical extravagance of other approaches to EQM, such as Wilson's. So let's take stock of our available views. First, we have Wilson's quantum modal realism, under which worlds are non-overlapping and concrete. I use sort of bolded lines to signify concrete. Next, we have a reading of Conroy, under which worlds are non-overlapping and just one is concrete. Other worlds are counterfactual worlds, ways the world might have been. But there's another way we might look at Conroy, one in which there is a branching structure with overlapping worlds, one of which is the concrete actual world, or maybe even one of which just happens to correspond to the actual world. On this reading, quantum decoherence events simply rule out possible futures, other ways the world might have been. Evidently, we have two choice dimensions available to us, one versus many concrete histories, and overlapping versus diverging histories. So I'll reorganize this to make things a little bit clearer for us. These are our available metaphysical readings of EQM. Notice that one quadrant remains unoccupied. So following Wallace and others, I call this option the Hydra view. This is the view where there are many concrete overlapping histories, all of which overlap at at least one point in time. But this option most closely resembles the view championed by DeWitt originally. Now, each of these available treatments of our branching structure treat future tense statements differently. So I will discuss precisely how. So suppose an agent in our world prepares an electron in the superposition of states and sends this electron through this inhomogeneous magnetic field before the electron interacts with the detector, which is represented by the line on the right. Prior to this event, the agent knows that relative to each branch, exactly one outcome will obtain, either positive h bar over 2, which is the eigenvalue associated with the up arrow eigenstate, or negative h bar over 2, the eigenvalue associated with the down arrow eigenstate, and not both. However, the future tense statements about what will be actualized associated with each of the 4 options I detailed on the previous slide differ from one another considerably. So let's examine each in turn, focusing both on indexical branch relative statements, which I denote with like BR, and global statements, which I denote with G. So first, according to option 1, there's one path that will be actualized through the dendritic structure, and histories never overlap. This suggests that before the agent performs their Stern-Gerlach experiment, there is a matter of fact about the outcome of the experiment. Of course, this result remains epistemically unavailable to the agent until they perform the experiment, but statements such as the outcome of the experiment will be positive h bar over 2 will have determinate truth values relative to each branch. According to option 2, there's also only one path through the dendritic structure that will be actualized, but the feature is open in the sense that prior to the branching events, there are multiple available features. The statements, the outcome of the experiment will be positive h bar over 2, does not have a determinate truth value prior to branching. There is no metaphysical fact as to which outcome will obtain. According to option 3, relative to each world, there is a matter of fact as to whether statements such as the outcome of the experiment will be X is true or false relative to each branch. However, if it's the case that the agent reads h bar over 2 off the detector, they can affirm that there is at least one other world in which the agent's counterpart reads the opposite outcome. Nevertheless, uncertainty according to this account is epistemic in nature. Prior to the experiment, the agent simply doesn't know along which branch their world will veer. All right, finally consider option 4. The world itself branches such that every possible outcome obtains. Yet, relative to each branch, the outcome h bar over 2 or negative h bar over 2 will obtain and not both. So this is possible if, as the decoherence story goes, the electron becomes entangled with the detector and the rest of the world as the entire world branches, entering a global state of superposition. These 4 accounts together form a complete set of available types of options across the 2 decision dimensions of diverging versus overlapping worlds and one concrete world versus many concrete worlds. Unless we wish to consider bizarre models with more than one concrete world, but I'm not sure why we would. There's no obvious reason to do that, so I'll treat this as a complete set. So toward a hydra metaphysics, I'll now examine the tense statements in this table to make a negative argument for why we ought to take the oft-discarded hydra view under serious consideration as a viable option. First, I begin with option 1. Of the set of diverging possible worlds, only one corresponds to the actual world. So it's instructive at this point to examine an excerpt from Everett's 1975 letter to Bryce DeWitt. I'll read this for you. From the viewpoint of the theory, all elements of a superposition, all branches, are actual. None are any more real than another. It's completely unnecessary to suppose that after an observation, somehow one element of the final superposition is selected to be awarded with the mysterious quality called reality, while others are condemned to oblivion. So if only one branch is concrete, and if we are to regard EQM as a deterministic theory, then what exactly dictates which branch is concrete? It's unclear how exactly an Everettian metaphysics that awards just one branch the honor of being more real than others meaningfully differs from stochastic accounts. So it just turns out that option 2 suffers from the same issue. If we assume that there is some sort of hidden variable doing the work, then we've added another element to the ontology of EQM, just diminishing its appealing simplicity. So if this selection process is purely stochastic, I don't know how option 2 tells a meaningfully different story about what the world is like compared to collapse theories. So there's a possible second issue for option 1. Notice that for any feature in measurement, the feature is closed in the sense that it's predetermined, like which outcome will obtain relative to each world. Alas, it also appears that this is true of option 3. It's not obvious how we ought to make sense of things that are in states of superposition according to these accounts, unless these superpositions are merely reflected in epistemic uncertainty. So maybe this is just fine and it's not a problem. Not everyone is made uncomfortable by this, but I will flag it at the very least so we have it documented. Now, although on first inspection, EQM really does appear to lend itself well to Wilson's quantum modal realism, this approach requires robust additional theoretical machinery. First, it requires an infinite set of possible worlds that are concrete, that have existed and will continue to exist for all time that our universe exists. Although Everettian quantum mechanics is strikingly beautiful in its simplicity, the addition of an infinite number of concrete worlds complicates the picture considerably. No longer does the universal wave function serve to describe only one universe. It now has to describe the entire set of metaphysically possible universes that share the same initial conditions as our own. This is heavy. I hope we agree that it feels very heavy, theoretically. So, metaphysical hub. A second problem for quantum modal realism follows closely behind. So quantum, like textbook quantum mechanics tells us, that when a particle passes through, for instance, a double slit barrier, the associated wave function of that particle diffracts through each slit and interferes with itself. Classic Young's double slit. It's the way to wow high school sophomores. On Wilson's account, this amounts to transworld interference where objects' Lewisian counterparts in other worlds seem to be interacting. Wilson, we don't want this in our metaphysics. David Lewis would not be stoked about this. Wilson responds to this concern by suggesting that the objector is mistaken and that this, like, quote, casts the explanation in a different light as one that, as one which features of a law-governed pattern rather than features of a causal process. So he writes, I will read this yellow segment for you. We ought not think of non-contingent subject matter in causal terms, and accordingly the explanations that EQM affords of quantum interference phenomena are better thought of as non-causal interactions than non-causal explanations than causal explanations. Even though we do not causally interact with the other branches, their existence is part of the best overall explanatory story behind the evidence that we have, end quote. So this response is subtle, but I remain unconvinced that it adequately addresses the problem. Wilson has made an appeal to a common cause explanation where decoherent branches of the universal wave function give rise to causally disconnected, aside from those interference terms, concrete worlds. If it's the case that these worlds really are distinct, then there ought not be evidence of the other worlds. Recall Lewis's requirements for worlds. They ought to be isolated from one another. There ought not be causal connections between members of any two worlds, V and W, unless V is W. That interference terms arise violates these requirements. Jacqueline Harding simply argues that the quantum modal realist must bite the bullet on this issue. But either way, the notion that counterparts within otherwise causally disconnected worlds happen to interfere with each other under certain circumstances is highly counterintuitive. And it remains a highly undesirable attribute of quantum modal realism. So I suggest we set this option aside. So as you can see, option 1 will not do. Endorable option 2. Option 3, quantum modal realism, is out as well. So we're left with the Heiger view. But it's not unproblematic, so I endeavor to vindicate it in the next section. So the problem of identity asks this. If it's the case that when a branching event transpires, that the world genuinely branches along with all the objects in it, then how can we possibly make sense of personal identity? So consider an agent, eta, which post-decoherence eta is really the same as the pre-decoherence version of eta. So to begin, consider for a moment a classical world very much like our own, but without quantum mechanical objects and processes. So never mind the degree to which such a world is possible, simply understand that in this particular world, things tend to just obey Newtonian mechanics. Here I take world to really mean the full universe with all its constituent parts, including all fields, particles, organism rocks, planets, and galaxy clusters. I thus follow Lewis's account of worlds, which says, quote, "The world we live in is a very inclusive thing. Our world consists of us and all our surroundings, however remote in time and space. Just as it is one big thing, having lesser things as parts, so likewise do other worlds have lesser otherworldly things as parts. Call parts of this sort material parts. Just as it is the case for our universe, this classical universe evolves in time." So at any arbitrary time, the state of this world could be specified in terms of, hold this slide in your mind. At any particular time, the state of this world could be specified in terms of the properties, or more precisely, the momentary properties of the objects that inhabit it. So the history of this world is defined as the complete ordered set of states. So both the state at one particular time, sorry, something funky with this. My slides right now. Anyway, okay. So I'm going to basically propose a new mereological part. I'm so sorry, I don't know what's up with my slides. But recall, we can have temporal parts generally, right? So pick any arbitrary times, T1 and T2. That chunk of this worm is going to be like a temporal part. So material parts then are parts of the laptop. We can take the screen, that's a material part. So some ordinary objects consist of parts in themselves, both in our quantum world and in this imaginary classical world. For instance, my laptop is composed of some collection of fundamental particles. In this sense, those particles are material parts of my laptop. It's also the case that my laptop persists through time. So it was assembled sometime in the vicinity of July 2018, and I hope that it persists through this degree, probably July 2025, when I recycle its parts. Following Lewis, the object that is my laptop really is more of a worm-like object through time. So if we suppose that my laptop, between the dates of March 14th, 2022 and April 30th, 2022, that's really just a temporal part of my laptop. So similarly, it is the case that the universe between such and such time is merely a temporal part of the world. Worlds themselves are also worm-like structures through time. So next, I'm going to shift my attention to our world, complete with its quantum mechanical peculiarities. I assume that EQM correctly describes the dynamics of its world. It's fine if you don't share this belief. I don't endorse the belief, we're just going to assume it. So anyway, under this model, wave function collapse never occurs. So consider an electron that begins in the up Z state, and then passes through a Stern-Gerlach, or the up X state, and then it passes through a Stern-Gerlach magnet oriented in the Z detector before striking, it passes through the inhomogeneous magnetic field before striking a detector. Under EQM, this triggers a branching event, where the electron becomes entangled with the detector in such a way that along one branch, the detector sees the electron as spin up, and along the other branch, the detector sees the electron as spin down. But which electron is really the pre-measurement electron? We might suspect that the up electron and the down electron are both the same as the original decoherence electron, and therefore the same object. After all, up until branching, they share the same history. But an action performed on the electron along the spin-up branch will not impact the electron along the spin-down branch, and vice versa, so it's incoherent to call them the same object. So these entities, therefore, cannot possibly be the same object that populates two different branches. Instead, on the single world model, both electrons are parts of the post-decoherence electron in some sense. This notion requires elaboration. After all, it's not the case that these two parts of the electrons are properly material parts of the electron post-measurement. They do not behave as though they have half the mass of an ordinary electron or half the charge. Nor is it the case that these two parts of the electron are temporal parts of the electron. Both exist at the same time. In order to properly understand the mereological relationship between the up electron and the down electron, we require another mereological type. So for the present purposes, it pays to narrow the definition of temporal parts to stages, just states of affairs at particular instances in time. So consider a temporal part of an electron in a branching world as illustrated here. This temporal part of the electron actually consists of many parts, each of which is the electron as it appears to observers relative to each branch. So call parts of this sort branch-like parts. Henceforth, object glyphs. More precisely, object glyphs are branch-relative temporal parts of objects. Critically, object object flips do not persist through time. Objects themselves perdure. This model entails that if we desire precision, we ought to treat those events that we formerly thought of as an agent performing an experiment on an object instead as an agent flip performing an experiment on an object flip. So similarly, the world at some time t consists of the set of world flips at that time t. So it might be useful to consider at once a complete path through the dendritic structure. This is a possible complete history, and it consists of all the ancestors of the world flip itself, and a set of consecutive future world flips along which one future available branch, as illustrated here. Ordinary objects follow the same structure, evolving into states of superposition as they decohere into object flips. So at this point, a skeptic might ask, if it's the case that post-decoherence object flips that share the same ancestor fall out of causal connection with one another, then why not regard all these branches as distinct worlds? But fortunately, by treating all the world flips as parts of the world, it's far less problematic when these interference terms arise between branches. It's unproblematic when objects that populate the same world causally interact. When objects interact across worlds, this violates our conception of the world. Since I advocate a one-world model endowed with an emergent branching structure consisting of branch-like parts of objects, it follows that the world itself, singular at any time, is the sum of world flips. So to an observer external to the branching structure, like a godlike observer, the world itself is in a superposition of states, and to agent flips, the worlds that they live in are really world flips. These interference terms occur between branches occasionally, but this is a non-issue. So, with this very logical account of objects in one dendritic world, I've dissolved the identity problem. So, that the universal wave function maps, okay. Anyway, why one world over many? Just some concluding remarks. It's really advantageous, I think, to decrease the number of worlds that we're ontologically committed to in favor of increasing the complexity of our world. Notice I'm not positing any new objects, really. We have the same number of objects. There are just more parts to them than we ever imagined before. So we're dropping all but one world from our ontology. We're just adding one additional relation between parts and objects. Thanks, Paul.
First, I just want to thank Ray for this really paper. It's given me a lot to think about, and yeah, I'm kind of working on similar topics, so it's really cool to engage with them on this. So kind of just to summarize a bit of Ray's paper before getting into some of the little commentary remarks. It does a number of things. So first, they describe 4 candidate accounts of branching in the DQM literature, the Hydra view, something like a one-world divergent history view, Conroy's overlapping histories view, and then Wilson's quantum modal realism. After that, Ray shows that all 4 accounts can accommodate giving singular determinate truth values to certain propositions, like within a branch, the X spin up will be the result of this experiment. And again, there's always singular determinate outcomes for experiments, propositions like this, as long as we index things to branches. In the case of the Hydra view, importantly, the global matter of fact, when we do an experiment that involves branching, just more branches, a number of outcomes obtained, right, but indexed to each branch is a singular determinate outcome. So then in section 3, Ray provides kind of negative argument for the Hydra view by showing some issues with the other 3 views, or I guess in this presentation is section 2, right? Doesn't matter. So Ray notes that the option 1, this one-world diverging history view, appears to privilege a single world as actual and concrete, and this stands in contrast with Everett's own view that the branches of EQM are all equally real. We shouldn't privilege one over the other. More importantly, they point out that in introducing new postulates to kind of get rid of, or to explain privileging one over the other, we end up with something like a non-Everettian view. We end up with something like a collapse model or variables theory. Then with respect to Wilson's quantum modal realism, Ray raises two distinct objections. The first one introduces an infinite set in introducing a set of infinite possible worlds, each sharing the same initial conditions, we kind of violate some of the initial motivations for the simplicity of Everett. Instead of just having like one hydra, we have infinitely many hydra. And then the other objection here is that, should have printed my font here. That if there's no overlap between branches, it seems like we have some difficulty in explaining interference as we get in like the double slit cases. And I'm really glad that we brought this up because it's something that I've never heard people talk about, and criticizing these divergent history views rather than like a one world hydra. It's like unclear how these entirely distinct worlds can interact with each other, though it seems like we'll talk about that today. So then the final section of the paper, Ray provides a positive account to kind of vindicate the hydra view by introducing this new mereological category of the blip, and attempts to show that, well, if we have the blip, we can solve some of these issues of identity that faced the hydra view before. So now I'll kind of turn to some critique. First thing, the great stuff is, I think that when attempting to give an account of like what the world really is, according to Everettian quantum mechanics, I think that the hydra view is a natural fit. The world is some kind of like multiverse with a bunch of sub-worlds, branches, and having them all as a singular thing, that's what physical reality really is a very natural fit for the Everett picture. Even David Wallace, I know like focused on some of the Lewisian versions of David Wallace's view in this paper, but David Wallace introduces those in order to solve problems of natural language. So he says that like with respect to technical, metaphysical, and physical talk about like what really exists, but the hydra view actually gets it more right. Think about just like what it really is. So on the other hand, I'm not quite sure that the problem of identity has been fully resolved. And it's especially once we get into questions about language use in identity. So here's some worries that I have. And these kind of come from things written by Simon Saunders and David Wallace in 2008, and then Tappenden in 2008. So, and then addressed a bit by Wallace in the Emergent Multiverse. So Ray purports to dissolve the problem of identity for the hydra view with help of their new mereological category, the blip. On Ray's description of the hydra view, an agent really is the temporally extended and branching region of the world hydra. So following Ray's example, we can call one of these object hydra that's an agent, Ada. So on the hydra view, Ada will have a number of branch-like parts, or blips, in many different branches. Consider one of Ada's blips at time t1, we'll call that one A1. So if A1 says something like, I will observe an upward deflection at time t2, we can ask two questions. The first is, who is A1 referring to with the pronoun I when saying, I will observe an upward deflection at time 2? And then the second question is whether or not A1's utterance is true, false, meaningful, meaningless, so on. So here's one option. If I, in this case, refers to the agent blip A1 itself, T1, then the utterance is going to be strictly speaking false. Why is that? Well, A1 exists only at T1, and that blip doesn't exist at T2. There's a different blip there. So it's going to turn out false when A1 says, I will observe this future blip. Now, we'll consider a paraphrase of these later, but first we'll turn to the second alternative. So the second alternative would be to take the I pronoun to refer to the whole agent hydra. So then, when A1 says, I will observe an upward deflection at T2, consider what happens. Well, that's going to be at least in part true. It's going to be in part true because Ada will have one blip at T2, or perhaps many, that observe upward deflections. But Ada is also going to have some blips at T2 and beyond who observe downward deflections, or make the case more complicated, all kinds of things. In other words, this is only telling part of the story, right? So while it's strictly speaking true that the hydra will have a part that observes some outcomes, the hydra is also going to have a part that observes other outcomes. And so this kind of statement doesn't, at the very least, capture like our normal sense of saying I will observe this outcome, meaning I will observe this and not the other outcome. Although perhaps we just need to abandon that. That's an option. The third potential option, which I think tries to accommodate the natural language a little bit better, is to have I refer to the agent blip again, like in the first case. So I refers to me, A1, this kind of time slice or blip. So for present-oriented propositions, we just mean like, I am standing right here, that means the blip is standing right here. But for future-oriented propositions, we kind of paraphrase. And we say, what I really mean when I say I will observe outcome up at T2, what I mean is there's a kind of successor blip that's not identical with me, but this other blip thing that's like me that observes this kind of counterpart or successor relation there. So if we do that, we can get rid of this problem of having multiple truth values for the same proposition, or it just kind of turning out trivially true, trivially false. There's going to be kind of one unique agent blip, it seems, in the future that has this particular outcome. But we kind of go back to the same problem as if we take the hydrogen one, full stop. So basically, if I'm making this utterance, and I'm the agent blip at T1, and I say, I will observe whatever at T2, well, I'm going to have a plurality of different successor blips at T2, right? One of them's going to observe up, one of them's going to observe down. It's unclear how I can refer to like one specifically as me, or the other specifically as me, as my unique continuant when I have both as these continuant blip parts. So it seems like no matter what option we have here, it's very difficult to kind of secure reference for having like specific outcomes as the kind of thing that agents will observe if we have any form of the hydra view or a kind of blip-centric view. So one thing that we might try to advocate for is like a kind of overlapping worm view of agents. We can talk more about that. So as it kind of stands, I think it's still a bit unclear on the hydra view how we can make sense of future-oriented statements and make sense of the intuitive kind of way that we talk about agents as expecting to observe unique outcomes or have unique histories. I don't think these issues are necessarily insurmountable, but I think more work needs to be done on the hydra view to flesh out the details of personal identity and language. And I think that Ray's paper does an excellent job of motivating this view and does great work by introducing this category of the blip to help us talk about these things. So.
Thanks, Jerome, for your detailed comments. So I'll address your primary concern about the problem of identity. So following the example you say, consider some agent Ada. Ada is named after my dog, by the way, who is a temporally extended object. As you mentioned, on my account, Ada is composed of a collection of blips spread across the branches and across time, such that Ada is a dendritic object. Your concern is this. So suppose that just prior to performing a Stern-Gerlach experiment, some Ada blip utters the sentence, I will see the result associated with the spin-up eigenstate. Just what does I refer to is your question. Yeah, okay. So some options. If I refers to that exact Ada blip, this approach isn't particularly coherent because blips are time indexed. So of course this Ada blip won't see any outcome. But next, suppose that I refers to the full dendritic Ada. If we go this route, as you point out, the statement, I will see the results associated with the spin-up eigenstate is true, but it's also the case that the statement, I will see the result associated with the spin-down eigenstate is also true. So let's consider two analogous cases. Imagine a class of school children who is on a field trip and child X gets lost. Using we to refer to the full class, child Y utters we got lost. This is clearly false. It's only the case that part of the class has gotten lost. Otherwise, that would be a full disaster, probably a teacher nightmare. Suppose that this Ada blip just so happened to bet on a previous Stern-Gerlach outcome several weeks ago, where according to the bet, this Ada blip along the up result branch would win several $1 million, while the Ada blip along the down branch would win absolutely nothing. So suppose that our eta blip of concern just so happens to have won nothing. It would be absolutely silly for our eta blip to say, I won several $1 million. It's only the case that part of eta won several $1 million, and it's not this one. So instead, I think we're left with this. When some eta blip uses the pronoun I, they're referring to their set of ancestors sort of along one branch. Looking toward the past, and descendants along many available future branches. So imagine again that this eta blip bet on the same Stern-Gerlach experiment. Reasonably, this eta blip can make factive statements about their past, either I won several $1 million or I didn't. Only one of these can be true, exactly one. So looking toward the future, and this is like really I think the interesting case, our eta blip ought to speak of future Stern-Gerlach measurements as follows. A descendant of mine will see each outcome, and no descendant will see both. More precisely, at a time in the future, I will have decohered into multiple blips, and at least one will see each possible outcome. Okay, so at this point, I don't want to commit myself to any particular treatment of probability in EQM, but I will state that the Deutsch-Wallace approach allows for agent blips, such as this part of eta, to reason about future events, even though all possible outcomes of every quantum measurement will obtain. So I assert that treating agent blips, as Deutsch and Wallace treat ordinary agents on their approach, appears unproblematic for mine as well. But finally, I would want to flag that my approach entails that we take on a new approach to conceptualizing ordinary objects as the mereological sum of their blips, and objects as we see them. This is a waterfall blip. We're adding more words to our language, maybe this is not a good thing. But it may be the case that this causes some discomfort around the notion of personhood. I'm not convinced that this is necessarily a problem, but I, of course, invite your impressions on just this point. Thanks, everyone.
All right, now we're open for questions.
Just a question about the composition,
Sure, yeah.
the trans branch composition. Because I mean, if you could have, presumably you can have quantum events in which measurements, basically, in which you get giving rise to what you want to say to two individuals. You know, so imagine a formation of a gamete, which might have a number of different ways with different outcomes, if that's a quantum event. So I'm just wondering about what's to stop, what's the reason within this, with trans world, trans branch composition. You've got a blip here. You've got basically two sort of gametes being formed. Why aren't they connected by the same relation as the two blips who correspond to the outcome of the two of the Stern-Gerlach measurement?
Yeah. Okay, sorry, I'm trying to.
Sorry, I just threw out. Just occurred to me, but you know what? To just having gerrymandered sums across branches.
Yeah, okay, so my assertion is that like for any term in the wave function, if you can like write your term in a state of superposition, then you can compose that as like one object or one temporal part of one
Right, so it's
object.
the history of the measurements that's uniting them.
No, you're asking about
across the
gametes?
Well, the branches across.
Oh.
Yeah, I was just trying to generate a thing. So
Okay.
it seems like you could generate trans branch, sort of gerrymandered trans branch sums, and you presumably want to have a principal reason to sort of pick out just the blips that correspond to is it eta?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you don't want a gerrymandered eta. You want just eta and the things
Just-
that related to. So is it a sort of an ancestral relation with previous quantum events that's uniting them into a whole? Because in temporal
Yes.
parts,
Yeah.
you've got the causal relation, which is doing it all, something.
Yeah, so are you putting time in this direction?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I had it inverted, or like rotated 90 degrees, so it's tremendously confused. Yes, so you could have eta and then eta string of memories, and it would be a worm-like thing in just layers, like assuming
Yeah,
so you
but
could.
that takes care of the branches as well.
Yeah.
Because of the right. Okay. So thank you.
Yeah, so the way you presented the Hydra, the analogy to temporal parts makes sense to me when you draw it as a single branching structure as you have. But we know that the reason there's no, I mean, taking the walls push up for granted, which you seem to, the reason we don't have a number of branches is because the branches depend on what coarse graining we pick, right? So you don't have just one hydra. You have a whole set of stacked overlapping hydras, right? Because at different coarse grainings you'll have, more and fewer branches, right?
Yeah.
So now I'm kind of wondering how that works for UV, because on a view like Wilson's, that seems fine, because not only do I not know perhaps which of the diverging branches I'm in at one level of coarse graining, right? So I don't know whether it will be up or down, after I do the experiment. I might also not know exactly what grain size I'm in, right? But because my experiments don't pick out a precise grain size. I don't have like a precise grain size in mind when I do physics. But that's okay too, because that's another slightly self-locating uncertainty. But I guess when you take a mereological view as you have, I wonder how that's supposed to work. Because the thing about temporal parts is that they look like they should just follow normal mereological relations. That when they overlap, it's fine because if I draw them like this, I can draw them like this, but that's fine because the reason this one overlaps these temporal parts is because it has subtemporal parts in common with them, whatever, right? There's normal mereology there. But in your case, it seems like I won't have a normal mereology precisely because of the stacking of different coarse grains. So because eta exists not only across the various branches of at this coarse graining, but across all the other coarse grainings, and all of those get stacked overlapping in a different dimension.
Yeah.
I'm a little worried that you end up with a very non-standard mereology.
That's interesting. I guess I hadn't thought of stacking various dendritic structures according to degrees of coarse graining. That's fascinating to me.
But isn't that what you have to do because the branching is supposed to be inverse relative, right?
Yes, it is. But I don't think that entails that you're stacking anything. It's just it's a representational tool. It's just how you happen to represent the dendritic structure, and that'll be a function of coarse graining. But I don't think that tracks anything metaphysical.
But the point is, the dendritic structure implies that there's a measurement here that branches, right?
Sure.
But Wallace's story is that's not the case. That we don't have any such definition of when measurements occur or they don't occur. The definition of measurements relative to our grain size. So because the definition of measurement is relative to grain size, you don't have a dendritic structure.
I see. I need to give that some more thought, I think. I guess as you were talking, I was thinking it's arbitrary how long we set our temporal parts, the duration of any particular temporal part.
That's fine.
Anyway, so I'm thinking it's arbitrary if you have this degree of coarse graining or this one. You're still summing over all of them, right? So if you're taking some sort of I'm not wild about the branch weights as a way to conceptualize probabilities or whatever, but let's jump on that bandwagon. You're still summing over all that there is.
Yeah, I'm not worried about the summing in terms of the probabilities. I'm just saying mereological summing. So because if you have infinite descending chains, right, mereologically, then you have infinite overlapping parts. And now you actually don't have an extensional, you can have extensionality, but you don't have a decomposition relation anymore. So you end up with strong company or something. You don't actually end up validating weak or strong
I see.
decomposition. So you end up with a kind of non-standard mereology. So it's not necessarily a problem, but it's just something that I think you should think about very carefully, because a simple analogy to temporal parts only works if you have a fixed dendritic structure.
Yeah, so if you just pick this degree of coarse graining,
right?
No problem. Yeah,
but
cool.
you can't do that, right?
Yeah. Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Questions and comments? Yeah. So, maybe with this in mind, we end up getting into some issues, but I was thinking, why don't you kind of hold the view that objects, agents, all of those kinds of things are particular worms rather than hydra? The world can be a hydra, but the kinds of things that we're interested in are branch relative, I have like a branch relative set of memories. I can, think about the things that have happened and some of those worms overlap, they share temporal parts. But it's not the case that like I am the Hydra, because then I might think all kinds of contradictory things at once. It makes more sense like when thinking about like an agent or a self or whatever, for that to be the kind of thing that is branch relative, and then we could talk about like other things like me that overlap with me and we share a history and past but not in the future.
Yeah, I think Paul Papinen has a view like
Yeah.
this. That seems to map really nicely to Wallace's Lewisian semantics, which can be overlaid on a Hydra metaphysics just fine. And I think that makes sense for natural language utterances, but if we're really committed to taking out what objects are as like terms in the global wave function, I think it makes much more sense to speak of objects as these dendritic structures. Maybe the discord with natural language utterances is not a virtue of this approach, but it's something I would like to think more about, because you raised this in Bristol also.
Yeah.
It's, you can have a capital P person among lowercase p people, where lowercase p people are really capital P people blitz.
Yeah. Or
And for
sums
all
of
our-
histories of lives, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So just to kind of follow up quickly on that, I think already when you're trying to find macroscopic ordinary objects in the wave function or whatever representational system you're going to have, that's already kind of going to be really tricky. So I don't know if you're already doing that kind of interest relative grading, I don't see why we couldn't kind of go all the way to get at the kinds of things that we really are interested in. But I don't know, I haven't thought that about this yet. I'm also biased here because I'm developing this overlapping worldview. So
Okay.
I guess.
Yeah, we should keep talking though. I think I get really uneasy when we use our natural language practices to inform our metaphysics.
Yeah.
So I'm wary of that sort of thing. Yeah.
So-
I'm not chairing my own session.
Oh, sorry, I don't mean to.
It's okay.
Okay, so given what you were last saying about how you're happy maybe with the Lewisian semantics, or at least not violently opposed to it,
Not yet.
I guess I'm wondering how your view and say Wilson's view are supposed to really differ in terms of ontological weight, which is how you kind of started out. So, because Wilson, so you clearly want to bite different bullets, right? Wilson has an easier story about saying something like, well, the detector actually pointed up because, well, there's one actual world, okay. But he has problems with, as you say, the interaction. You have a problem with interaction, you have a different semantic, problem about, actuality statements, okay, fine. But, so that biting that bullet might determine kind of which way you want to talk. But I don't really understand why he has any more kind of metaphysical weight than you do, right? I mean, the whole story is just that, well, there is a fundamental reality. We did a course training. We saw some stuff. I don't understand how I decided to talk about that stuff changes how much metaphysical weight there is.
Yeah, so on my account, we have one world. On Al's account, we have an infinite number of worlds that are concrete and actual.
Yeah, but a world is just an interest relative graining. So what? It's just a semantic. I don't understand how saying there's a world, one of many million worlds is different than saying the semantics is cleaner if we talk like that.
I see. Yeah, this is something I'm dying to sit down with him to sort of hash out, because he feels very strongly that our views are ontologically equivalent. Okay. It's the difference between there being one laptop, of which this is a laptop flip, and an infinite number.
But whether those are different or not depends, it seems to me. If they were fundamental entities, then if you count, you definitely get different stuff. But on the whole Lewisian picture of the world, right, we say adding stuff up in different ways doesn't really get new stuff, right? The trout turkey's not supposed to add to the furniture of the world. So it seems like the same thing here. If these are just like different ways of graining up the world, then I don't see why that's supposed to like add anything that we would care, anything we care about logically.
So the session is officially end. You can